I thought my wife's affair was the worst betrayal until the final blow shattered my world. I never saw it coming. My wife, Claire, and I had been together for over a decade, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, I always thought we were solid. Sure, life had thrown its fair share of challenges at us, stress from work, the pressures of raising 2 kids, and the occasional argument, but betrayal? That was the last thing I expected. It all started one unassuming evening. I had just come back from a long day at the office, ready to settle into our usual routine. Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner, and the kids were upstairs playing. Everything seemed normal. Until I saw her phone. It wasn't like me to snoop. I trusted Claire. But as I walked by the kitchen counter, her phone buzzed with a notification, and something about it caught my eye. The message preview was from a name I didn't recognize, Ethan. A coworker? A friend? I didn't think much of it at first, but something nagged at me, an unease I couldn't shake. Dinner passed in a blur, my mind racing as I tried to figure out why that one message bothered me so much. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, after Claire had gone to bed, I couldn't resist the urge any longer. I picked up her phone and unlocked it. What I found hit me like a punch to the gut. There they were, dozens of messages between Claire and this man, Ethan. They weren't work-related or friendly. They were intimate. The kind of messages that should only be exchanged between 2 people deeply in love. My stomach churned as I read through them, each word feeling like a knife twisting deeper. My hands shook as I scrolled through the texts, feeling a mix of disbelief, anger, and crushing sadness. The conversation spanned months. I had been completely oblivious, blind to the fact that my wife, the woman I loved, the mother of my children, had been carrying on an affair right under my nose. I sat there in the dark, phone in hand, trying to process what I had just discovered. How could she do this to me? To our family? Memories of our life together flashed before my eyes, the day we met, our wedding, the birth of our children. And now, all of it felt like a lie. The sound of Claire stirring in the bedroom snapped me back to reality. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out how to handle the situation. But one thing was clear, my life had just been turned upside down, and there was no going back. In that moment, sitting alone in the dimly lit kitchen, I felt the weight of the betrayal settle over me like a heavy cloud. This wasn't just a mistake or a bad decision. This was a deliberate choice, one that shattered the trust one had placed in her. And now, I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The woman lying next to me had broken my heart in the worst possible way, and I had no idea how to confront her. I watched her sleep, wondering how she could carry on like nothing had happened while I was drowning in the pain of her betrayal. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to hold it together for the kids while silently grappling with the enormity of what I had learned. Claire was none the wiser, going about her daily routine as if everything was normal. But I knew the truth now, and every time I looked at her, it felt like a dagger in my chest. I thought about confronting her 100 times. I rehearsed what I would say, imagined the look on her face when I revealed that I knew. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. I wasn't ready to face the fallout, not yet. Instead, I kept my distance, quietly observing her, looking for any sign of guilt or remorse. But Claire was a master at hiding her tracks. She acted like the perfect wife, attentive and caring, as if she hadn't ripped my heart out and stomped on it behind my back. It was maddening. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was fine while my world crumbled around me. I needed answers. I needed to know why she did it, and more importantly, if our marriage was worth saving. But first, I had to confront the brutal reality that the life I thought I had was nothing more than a facade. And so, I prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The days dragged on in a torturous haze, each one heavier than the last. The weight of what I knew was suffocating me, and I could barely look at Claire without feeling a surge of anger. I kept replaying those messages in my head, wondering how long I had been living in the dark while she carried on with Ethan. Every laugh, every kiss, every touch we'd shared felt tainted now. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The confrontation had to happen, and soon, or it would eat me alive. But how do you accuse the person you've spent years building a life with of something so unforgivable? How do you even start that conversation? One evening, after the kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I sat across from Claire in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I took a deep breath, my heart racing, and spoke before I could lose my nerve. "Claire, we need to talk." She looked up at me, confused by the seriousness in my tone. "What's going on?" I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. "Who's Ethan?" The color drained from her face. For a split second, she froze, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I watched as her mind scrambled to come up with an explanation, but there was no undoing what I had seen. No lie could cover up the months of deceit. Her voice wavered as she tried to respond. I don't know what you mean. My anger flared. Don't lie to me, Claire. I saw the messages. I know what's been going on between you and him. She looked down, guilt and fear flickering in her eyes. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt like the walls were closing in on us. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I never meant for it to happen. Never meant for it to happen? I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. You've been carrying on an affair for months, Claire. How can you say you never meant for it to happen? She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I was lost. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. I felt so disconnected, and Ethan, he was there for me. It just spiraled out of control. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. My entire body was shaking with anger, hurt, and confusion. Disconnected? That's your excuse? You could have talked to me, Claire. You could have told me how you were feeling instead of going behind my back. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I know I messed up. I don't even know how it got this far. But it doesn't mean I don't love you. Love me? I barked out a bitter laugh. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the weight of her guilt fully sink in. I'm so sorry, Jack. I don't want to lose you. Please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through it. I don't want to throw everything away. I stared at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, and felt a pang of sorrow deep in my chest. But the anger was still there, too, simmering just beneath the surface. How could she expect me to move past this? How could we ever rebuild what she had shattered? I don't know if that's possible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She started crying again, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the betrayal. I couldn't let myself be swept away by her tears. I need time to think, I finally said, my tone cold and final. I can't just pretend everything's okay. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the couch. I didn't know where to go or what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure, nothing about our marriage would ever be the same again. The Claire I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't trust, and the future of our relationship hung in the balance. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how things had spiraled so far out of control. Could we really fix this? Or had the damage been done beyond repair? There were no easy answers, only more questions. The next few days felt like a slow-motion car crash. Claire and I tiptoed around each other, barely speaking, our words reduced to short, awkward exchanges about the kids or daily routines. The tension in the house was suffocating, an invisible weight pressing down on both of us. But the kids, they were oblivious, carrying on with their laughter and games, unaware of the storm brewing between their parents. I couldn't stop thinking about what Claire had said. Her apologies, her promises to fix things, they played on a loop in my head, but none of it felt real. The betrayal had cut too deep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with Ethan, and every time I opened them, I saw the life we'd built together crumbling at my feet. One evening, as I sat in the car after another long day at work, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. The limbo was killing me, and I knew we needed to confront what was next, whether it was the end of our marriage or the beginning of something new, I had no idea. But I couldn't stand the silence any longer. When I walked into the house, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes were red, puffy from crying, and she looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her, wondering how we'd gotten here. We need to talk, I said quietly, taking a seat across from her. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I know. For a few minutes, we sat there in silence, both of us unsure of where to begin. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the ice. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, I started, my words slow and deliberate. About fixing this. But Claire, I don't know how to get past what you did. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, she didn't look away. I know I hurt you, Jack. I know it's not something that can be fixed overnight. But I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I shook my head. Love isn't enough, Claire. It's not just about the betrayal. It's about trust, and right now, I don't have that. You broke something in me, in us. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was selfish, and I made the worst mistake of my life. We sat there, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I wanted to believe her, to think that maybe we could rebuild what we had, but a part of me wasn't sure if that was even possible. I need time, I finally said. Time to figure out if I can forgive you, if I can ever trust you again. I don't know what that looks like right now, but I can't make any promises." She nodded, her expression broken. "I understand." Over the next few weeks, things remained strained between us. We tried counseling, sitting across from a therapist and talking about our feelings, our anger, and our guilt. But every session felt like we were just scratching the surface, avoiding the deeper wound that was festering beneath. The betrayal was always there, lurking in the background, and no matter how hard we tried, it was impossible to ignore. One night, after another grueling session, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how it would be forever. Would I always be looking over my shoulder, questioning every word, every look? Could I ever feel secure in our marriage again? As the months went on, the answer became clearer. While I wanted to believe we could move past this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The connection we once had, the love, the trust, it was gone, and no amount of counseling or apologies could bring it back. Eventually, I made the hardest decision of my life. One evening, as Claire and I sat in the living room, I told her it was time to let go. Time to stop pretending we could fix something that was too broken to repair. "We can't keep doing this, Claire," I said, my voice heavy with finality. "We've tried, but it's not working. I think it's time we face the truth." She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, but this time, she didn't argue. Deep down, she knew it too. We had reached the end of the road. The divorce was messy, as they often are. There were arguments, fights over custody, splitting assets. But eventually, we worked it out. And while it was painful to see our family fall apart, there was also a strange sense of relief. We had been living in a state of denial for too long, and now, at least, we could move forward, even if it was on separate paths. Looking back, I often wonder if things could have been different, if we had communicated better, if we had worked harder to stay connected. But those are just empty what-ifs. The truth is, sometimes love isn't enough to save a marriage. Sometimes, the wounds are too deep, and the only way to heal is to let go. Now, I focus on rebuilding my life, being the best father I can be for my kids, and learning to trust again. It's not easy, but it's a journey I'm willing to take, one step at a time. The divorce papers were signed on a gray Thursday afternoon. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the type of place where emotions felt out of place. As the judge read out the final decree, I felt an odd mix of relief and sorrow. This was it, the official end of my marriage to Claire. After everything we had been through, it all boiled down to a few signatures and a quiet goodbye. I glanced over at Claire as the judge spoke, but she didn't meet my eyes. She just stared down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absent-mindedly before sliding it off and setting it on the table. That simple act felt more symbolic than anything the judge said. It was the final nail in the coffin. As soon as it was over, I stepped out into the cold autumn air, taking a deep breath, trying to clear my mind. The weight of the last few months lifted slightly from my chest, but the hole it left was still there, raw and aching. I wanted to move forward, but I had no idea how. We had agreed to share custody of the kids, and while that part was settled, the idea of splitting time with them felt unbearable. How was I supposed to explain to them that their world was about to change? That their mom and dad wouldn't live together anymore, that their lives would be divided between two homes? They were still so young, and the guilt weighed heavily on me. Later that evening, I sat in my nearly empty apartment, a glass of whiskey in my hand, and stared at the pile of boxes that marked the new chapter of my life. Everything felt foreign, strange. I hadn't lived alone in over a decade, and now here I was, starting over at 35, with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. Claire and I had exchanged the necessary pleasantries during the process, but there were no long talks, no heartfelt farewells. Everything was transactional, as if we both knew that digging into the emotional mess would only make things worse. So, we left it as it was, unfinished, unresolved. A week after the divorce was finalized, Claire and I sat down with the kids to tell them. They didn't fully understand at first, but as we explained how things would work, how they'd spend time with both of us in different houses, the reality began to sink in. The tears, the confusion, the questions, they all came in waves, and each one felt like a punch to the gut. Claire and I put on brave faces, assuring them that we still loved them, that we would always be there for them. But behind those smiles, we both knew the truth: nothing would ever be the same again. As the days turned into weeks, the routine of shared custody began. I'd pick the kids up on Fridays, drop them off on Sundays. The awkward handovers with Claire were brief, our conversations reduced to logistics and schedules. We were civil, but the warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by a cold, distant politeness. It wasn't until months later, when I bumped into Ethan at a grocery store, that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. He was with another woman, someone I didn't recognize. Our eyes met briefly, but neither of us said a word. He just turned and walked away, as if I didn't exist. Seeing him again stirred something inside me, a mix of anger and closure. I had spent so much time thinking about his betrayal, about how he and Claire had destroyed my life. But standing there, watching him disappear down the aisle, I realized something important: it wasn't worth it anymore. Holding on to the anger wasn't going to bring me peace. It wasn't going to fix anything. That night, for the first time since everything had happened, I let it go. All the bitterness, the rage, the endless questions of why, I released it all. I wasn't forgiving them, not really. But I was done letting their actions define me. In the end, the divorce wasn't just about separating from Claire. It was about finding myself again, about reclaiming the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the one I had now. And I was determined to make the best of it. As I looked at my kids, asleep in their beds that night, I knew I still had a reason to keep going. They were my reason. They were my new beginning. And in that, I found the strength to move forward, one step at a time. Life after the divorce wasn't easy, but it was simpler in a way. The emotional chaos had quieted down, leaving behind an empty space where the pain once was. Slowly, I began to rebuild. The days felt longer, quieter, but they were no longer consumed by the constant storm of betrayal and heartache. Now, it was about learning how to live again. The kids adapted faster than I expected. Their resilience amazed me. In the beginning, I worried endlessly about how the separation would affect them. But as the weeks passed, they seemed to settle into the new routine. Weekdays with Claire, weekends with me. We made it work, even though it felt strange at times, like I was living two separate lives. During my weekends, I threw myself into fatherhood with a renewed sense of purpose. Every moment with the kids felt precious now, even the mundane ones: making breakfast, driving them to soccer practice, reading bedtime stories. I didn't take any of it for granted anymore. I knew how fragile it all was, how quickly things could fall apart. My own healing was slower. For a long time, I couldn't shake the bitterness that lingered from Claire's betrayal. I would see reminders of her and Ethan everywhere, on social media, in conversations with mutual friends, even in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. Moving on felt like an impossible task. But then, something shifted. One day, while I was out with the kids at a park, watching them play, I realized that the weight I had been carrying for so long wasn't as heavy anymore. I wasn't thinking about Ethan or Claire every minute of the day. I wasn't replaying the past in my head like a broken record. Instead, I was just there, in the present, watching my children laugh and run through the grass. It was the first time in a long time that I felt truly free. The weeks continued to pass, and I started making small changes in my life. I began working out again, reconnecting with old friends, even exploring new hobbies I'd abandoned years ago. It wasn't about distracting myself from the pain anymore. It was about rebuilding who I was outside of the marriage, outside of the betrayal. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine and thought about the future. For the first time, it didn't feel like a black hole of uncertainty. It felt open, full of possibilities. Maybe one day, I would meet someone new. Maybe not. Either way, I was okay with it. I was enough on my own. Claire and I kept things civil for the kids' sake. We didn't speak much outside of co-parenting, but when we did, it was respectful, if not warm. The wounds were still there, but they weren't as fresh anymore. We had both moved on in our own ways. She had her life with Ethan now, and I had mine with the kids. As the first year post-divorce came to an end, I looked back at everything that had happened and felt a strange sense of gratitude. It wasn't for the pain or the betrayal, but for the growth that came out of it. I had survived something that had once seemed insurmountable. I had found strength in myself that I didn't know existed. And as I stood there, watching my children sleep, I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding a life for them, I was rebuilding a life for myself. A life that was mine, free from the shadows of the past. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was enough. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain. It's been nearly 2 years since the divorce, and life looks vastly different now. I wouldn't say everything is perfect, but I've learned that perfection is a myth. What I have now is peace, and that's something I hadn't felt in a long time. After the dust settled, I moved out of the house where we'd built so many memories. It was too heavy with the past, a constant reminder of what had been lost. I found a smaller place, closer to the kids' school, and it quickly became home. The first night there, as I unpacked boxes in the quiet, I felt something unfamiliar, a glimmer of hope. The kids adjusted faster than I expected. They seemed happy, even with the back and forth between houses. They had their rooms at both homes, their toys, their routines. Claire and I had found a rhythm that worked, though the scar of what happened between us would always be there. She was still with Ethan, though I didn't care much about their relationship anymore. I had stopped obsessing over their life together. It wasn't my concern anymore. I focused on creating something new for myself and for the kids. Weekends with them became my sanctuary, filled with laughter, board games, movie nights, and trips to the park. I wasn't the same person I was before the betrayal, but I realized that was okay. The pain had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. In fact, it had made me stronger. I had started dating again, cautiously. Nothing serious, just getting back into the world, meeting new people. The first time I went on a date, it felt surreal. I wasn't sure I was ready, but I forced myself to try. The date itself wasn't memorable, but the fact that I had taken that step was. It felt like a turning point, a small victory. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe with a friend, she asked me how I was feeling about everything. For the first time, I didn't have to force a smile or fake optimism. I told her the truth, I was okay. Truly okay. The anger, the bitterness, the betrayal, they didn't control me anymore. They were part of my story, but they weren't my entire story. As the months passed, I started to rediscover the things that made me happy before everything fell apart. I picked up hobbies I had long abandoned, woodworking, running, even cooking. I found joy in the simple things again, like a quiet morning coffee or a long walk with the kids. Claire and I kept things amicable for the children. Our conversations were cordial, sometimes even friendly. We had both moved on, in different ways. She had her life, and I had mine. There was no longer any desire to rehash the past or point fingers. What's done is done. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The colors blended together in a way that reminded me of how life had become messy, unpredictable, but undeniably beautiful in its own way. The person I had become was different, wiser, more resilient. I had learned that life goes on, even after heartbreak, and that there's always room for new beginnings. The kids were inside, laughing as they played a board game together. I smiled to myself, realizing how far we had all come. We had built something new, something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace with where I was. The future was no longer something to fear. It was wide open, full of possibilities. And as I sat there, soaking in the moment, I knew that whatever came next, I would be ready. Because I had already survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side.